from the Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O God.
Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." Jesus replied to him, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbitrator?" Then Jesus said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed, for though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space in my barn to store my harvest." And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down the barn and build a much larger one. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, 'Now, as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, the things you have hoarded in your barns, to whom will they belong?' Thus will it be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in the things that matter to God." These are the words spoken to us by our brother Jesus. Praise to you, Jesus Christ. Have a seat. On September 28, 2022, right in the midst of COVID, a hurricane called Ian hit the coast of Florida. It was the deadliest hurricane to strike the state of Florida since 1935. Caused all kinds of widespread damage across western Cuba, Florida, and the Carolinas. On Pine Island, just off the Florida mainland, an emotional Alan Bickford said he was trying to take a longer view of the destruction of his home. "It's like a death of a loved one," Alan said. "There are times when there are these little glimmers or slivers of hope, and then everything falls apart." Matt Gill was excited about starting a new life in his move from Manchester to London, and he crammed 24 years worth of possessions into a van that he borrowed from a friend's friend. He said, "I wanted to do it in one trip, so I shoved everything in. All my clothes, including my favorite Armani suits. They were all packed. Photos, my camera, my entire collection of music and stereo, my bed, books, TV, letters, cash, credit cards, phone chargers, address book, birth certificate, passport, and every other form of ID, even my girlfriend's paintings, my mate's grandma's table." It's amazing how much you can accumulate over a couple of decades. Gill said, "I drove into central Manchester to wait for my mate, Guy, who should have been at my flat hours earlier, but got delayed. So I parked and went for coffee with a friend. 20 minutes later, when Guy finally arrived, we returned to the van, but the van was gone. The space where it had been seemed to loom towards me, and I felt dizzy. I had no insurance, and all my earthly possessions were in that van." How would that feel, to see everything that you've accumulated over the years gone in a moment's notice? "Vanity, vanity," says the writer of Ecclesiastes. What was the point? Only to lose it all. And to lose it in the case of Matt Gill to a thief, someone who did not deserve all that Matt worked his whole life to accumulate. We would do well to heed the warnings of the writer of Ecclesiastes, to hold our possessions loosely, to realize that they are ours but for a moment. That can be a difficult task, in a consumer-driven world. A world that leads us to think that our possessions are our rewards for our hard work and our determination. Symbols of right living, of earned power and prestige. Eddie Murphy in the movie Trading Places, anybody see it? He says it occurred to him that the best way to hurt rich people is to turn them into poor people. So the film is based on the 1882 novel The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. And so this poor street hustler played by Eddie Murphy and a commodities broker played by Dan Aykroyd do just that. They trade places. They challenge the theory on nature versus nurture and the idea that poor people are trapped in cycles of poverty by their own characteristic flaws. And then accumulation of wealth speaks to an individual's worth and is a determining factor in life satisfaction. What is my life worth if I've not made something of myself? How many people live with that sense of failure and cannot find joy in their everyday existence? Now, I doubt very much that any one of us would turn away a very generous gift of wealth if it came our way. The rich man's joy in knowing that he could retire comfortably sounds wonderful, something that, most of us are enjoying right now. But our gospel reading helps us to make sense of what is vain in that accumulation of wealth. It starts with a scene that is all too common when a parent or a grandparent dies, fighting over the will. Two brothers contesting their inheritance. In a study by Wash U, over 1/3 of parents with wills leave an unequal distribution to their children. Particularly vulnerable are those children with weak relationships to their parents. They might be stepchildren or adopted children. Maybe they've been estranged from those parents. There are other complicating factors. 60% of siblings who disputed the wills of their parents said they did not regret it, even though 30% of them never spoke to each other again. Money over relationships, or in the words of Jesus, they stored up treasure for themselves, but were not rich in the things that were important to God. The rich fool is an example of someone who lived a very self-indulgent life, and thus he isolated himself from the rest of society. Notice how often he referred to himself and never talked about others. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space in my barn to store my harvest. This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, now it is for you. You have so many good things stored up. Rest, eat, drink, and be merry." Jesus calls us from that egocentric existence to the collective where we belong. Imagine if this man said, "What shall we do? For because of the hard work of my laborers, we have more than what we can store in our barn. Let us build a larger barn and store our grain and our goods for a time when the community requires them. Or better yet, let us distribute the abundance we have and store just enough to fill our barns. This way we will have enough for everyone for many years, so that we may all rest, eat, drink, and be merry." Then you know what? Even if God did call him home, even if, as God said, "This night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, the things you have hoarded in your barns, to whom will they belong?" The answer would have been, "To all those who labored with me, to my neighbors and their children, to the hungry and poor. Let them prosper from all that I leave behind." What a beautiful way to die in peace. It was Martin Luther King who said that all of life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. As long as there is poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people cannot expect to live more than 20 or 30 years, no man can be totally healthy. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. If the foolish rich man had followed this principle, he would have been like Boaz in the Old Testament, who also had an abundance of crops to harvest. And he harvested the crops in such a way that the parameter of his fields, he told his laborers, leave the crops there for the poor and the hungry to come and help themselves. The things that God cares about are simple and not vain. They are that which brings about God's kingdom on earth. God calls us to be co-creators in that kingdom. Our efforts to do that during our time on earth are a legacy with lasting value. When my mother was alive and I used to visit her on Sundays, as was our tradition, she used to ask me about her friends from church, particularly the ones who had died, and she would always say, how many people attended their funeral? I thought that was kind of silly at first. Like, you know, funerals with the aged were like their final popularity contest, you know, like we never really outgrew high school when we were innately aware of who the popular kids were. But after these readings, I thought about those who show up at the end. Those whose lives we have impacted in one way or another. Maybe the people who will lay us to rest are the visible footprints that we leave in this world. I've heard it said recently that if we think about the oldest person who held us as a child and calculate the years of their birth, and then think about the youngest person that we know, that we are close to, and we anticipate their lifespan, the number of years between the birth of the oldest person and the death of the youngest person is a guess at the extent of the years that we have impacted humanity. So my grandmother was born in 1902, and my youngest granddaughter's 2 years old, little Brooklyn. If she lives to be 82, then the number of years that I've left an impression is maybe 203 years. The impression I leave in that footprint on their lives and the lives of those that I encounter during those years is what matters to God. We can sit like the wise old fool and calculate our personal worth, or we can see ourselves as a part of a larger collective. Not an island to ourselves, but an essential part of a community where what we have is to be shared and shared alike. I've had the privilege lately of taking we have a family from Argentina living with us. They're an immigrant family. And we took them to the food pantry at Restoration Urban Ministries. They thought they could get some food and some clothing. And I'd never been there before, although I knew about Reverend Irvin Williams and his efforts to buy a hotel and turn it into housing for homeless families. You know, at first the children in my car were afraid to get out because it felt like a back alley to them. There was a metal shed where they had 2 tables with some canned goods and some hand-picked tomatoes. The 10-year-old boy was also a little shaken to be greeted by a poor elderly black man and a group of lovely black women who welcomed them, filling their bags with canned goods out of the little that they had, encouraging them to look through 2 racks of worn adult clothing to see if there might be a winter coat or a pair of shoes. You know, we expect to receive help from the rich, from the wives' clubs and auxiliaries who volunteer their time. We expect gently used items discarded from homes that have designer decor, and food donated from pantries that are bursting at the seams. But no one expects a worn man in ragged clothes to hand you a faded box of birthday candles for the children and some tomatoes from his garden. This was a place where those who knew poverty and despair lovingly embraced a homeless family from Latin America. "You be sure to come back next week," said the elderly gentleman who helped them select their food. "Next week, we'll have meat and a bigger supply." But that's the sort of thing that makes God smile. The thing that displays what matters to God. I'm thinking that maybe Eddie Murphy had it wrong in Trading Places. Maybe one of the greatest things that can happen to a wealthy person is to walk in the shoes of a poor person, at least for a while, to understand how we impact each other and how truly interdependent the world is. So a word to the rich old fool in our gospel today. If the title of fool befuddles you as you count your personal wealth and relax into your self-made retirement plan, consider for a moment your own place in the universal oneness of which we are all a part, from which we all arise, and to which we will all return.